The first time a German Panzer crew saw a Sherman, they laughed. Not the polite kind of laughter. The belly-deep roar that echoes through the cold steel hull of a tank after a long march. They called it Tommy's toy, or the Ronson, mocking the Allied machine for what they claimed it was best at, catching fire. To them, the Sherman looked soft, too tall, too clumsy, a box on treads. Its gun seemed laughable compared to the long, predatory barrel of the Panzer IV or the menacing silhouette of the Panther. In the early days of the war, Germany's armored divisions were gods of the battlefield, and gods, they thought, didn't need to fear toys. But history has a cruel sense of humor. In 1942, deep within American factories that never slept, something was stirring. Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago. Cities that once made cars were now forging the steel sinews of war. Assembly lines that once fitted windshields now rolled out turrets. Mechanics who once tuned engines for customers named Johnson or Smith were now tuning them for soldiers they'd never meet. They built a tank not for perfection, but for persistence, something simple, reliable, and fast to produce. Its name, the M4 Sherman. To the men designing it, the mission was clear. The Allies didn't need a monster. They needed an army, and that meant a tank that could be shipped across oceans, fixed in muddy fields, and still fight the next day. Every nut, every bolt, every weld served a single idea. Numbers win wars. Still, when the first Shermans rumbled off the ships and into battle, the skepticism was everywhere. British crews who tested them in North Africa whispered doubts over mugs of cold tea. They admired its speed, but questioned its armor. They loved its engine, but cursed its high silhouette. One British officer quipped, "It's like driving a barn." Yet when the time came to face the Africa Corps, that barn would have to fight lions. The Germans, meanwhile, had crafted masterpieces. The Panzer III and IV were elegant killers, precise, engineered, deadly. In comparison, the Sherman looked crude, almost improvised. Its rounded armor reflected sunlight like a cheap coin. Its 75mm gun lacked the punch to pierce German tanks at long range. From a distance, the battlefield told a clear story. One side had craftsmanship, the other had quantity. In Tunisia, the first great meeting of these machines unfolded under a sun that burned men and metal alike. The sand shimmered like molten glass, and every sound, the whine of engines, the metallic groan of treads, seemed to vibrate through the desert floor. Lieutenant Jack Harris, a 23-year-old commander from Kansas, sat inside his Sherman named Lucky Penny. He'd only been in Africa for a week. The tank smelled of oil, sweat, and nervousness. "Remember," he told his gunner, "we're not trying to outgun them. We outthink them." His words barely left his mouth when the radio crackled. "Panzer sighted, 2 o'clock. Through the periscope, Harris saw it. A Panzer IV, gleaming, crouched like a wolf behind a ridge. Its long cannon glinted in the sun. The first shot came from the German. A streak of fire cut through the air and slammed into the sand beside Lucky Penny. The shockwave rattled the hull. "Driver, move!" "Zigzag," Harris shouted. The Sherman lurched forward, engine roaring, throwing up clouds of dust. The gunner lined up the turret, heart hammering. "On target! Fire!" the Sherman's 75mm barked. The round flew, hit, but bounced off the Panzer's sloped armor. The German didn't miss twice. Its shell tore into another Sherman nearby, setting it ablaze. Inside the burning wreck, men screamed as flames ate through metal. Harris's crew watched in horror and in rage. They maneuvered, keeping distance, moving through smoke and confusion. Harris knew they couldn't win head-on, but the Sherman was faster, lighter, more agile. He swung behind a dune, looping wide until the German tank, focused on its next prey, didn't see them coming. "Now!" Harris ordered. The gunner fired again, this time into the Panzer's exposed flank. The shell struck true. A burst of orange flame erupted, followed by black smoke. The German tank shuddered, then went still. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal. Inside Lucky Penny, Harris exhaled for the first time in minutes. "Guess they don't laugh as much when you shoot back," he muttered. Word spread through Allied ranks. The Sherman could fight. It wasn't invincible, but it was dependable. Crews began to trust it, even love it. They gave their tanks names: Courageous, Widowmaker, Hope Floats. Each was more than steel. It was home, protection, and coffin all at once. German crews, meanwhile, grew uneasy. Reports filtered through that the Americans could replace their losses faster than they could destroy them. One officer wrote in his journal, "For every tank we burn, 5 more appear." Like ants. The Sherman's greatest weapon wasn't its gun. It was the men inside it, and the factories behind it. By 1943, the laughter had softened into concern. The Germans still boasted superior tanks, but they were expensive and time-consuming to build. A Panther took weeks, a Tiger, months. A Sherman? Days. They came off ships by the hundreds, painted olive drab, and ready to roll. Some still called it the joke. But the joke was wearing thin. Even the mighty Wehrmacht began to realize that sheer quality couldn't stop a flood. The battlefield was shifting. Not to the strongest, but to the most relentless. In the evenings after battle, Sherman crews would sit on the hulls of their tanks, passing cigarettes, staring at the horizon. They spoke quietly about home, about friends lost, about tomorrow's march. The sound of distant gunfire never really stopped. But in their tired eyes burned something unshakable, a belief that they could keep going when others couldn't. One night, Harris wrote in his small, sweat-stained journal, "They call us the clumsy tank. Maybe we are. But clumsy keeps moving, clumsy keeps fighting, and clumsy doesn't stop." He closed the book, looked at Lucky Penny, and smiled faintly. The desert wind carried the scent of oil and ash. Somewhere out there, another Panzer was waiting. But the laughter that once echoed through German radios was fading into something else. Disbelief. The joke of the battlefield was beginning to learn how to punch back. And in time, it would not only survive the war, it would define it. As the sun sank behind the dunes, turning the sky into molten gold, the Sherman crews prepared for another dawn, another fight, another chance to prove that Mockery couldn't kill steel and arrogance couldn't stop a tide. The desert would soon give way to greener battlefields. Europe was waiting, Normandy was waiting, and the laughter, well, it was about to die in the hedgerows. The desert wind never stopped. It carried the sting of sand and the echo of engines, American engines, British engines, all pushing east toward the German lines. The laughter that once followed the Sherman had faded into the dry air of North Africa, replaced by the grinding growl of tracks carving across dunes. The joke had come to fight for real now. Lieutenant Jack Harris sat atop Lucky Penny as dawn painted the horizon in streaks of orange and gold. The night chill still clung to his uniform, but soon the heat would come, heavy and merciless. Around him stretched a vast army of Shermans and Crusaders, their silhouettes shimmering in the rising light. Dust rose like smoke as mechanics shouted. Drivers revved engines, and tank commanders checked maps with weary eyes. Ahead lay the German Afrika Korps, veterans hardened by years of victory under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Harris lit a cigarette, the flame flickering against the wind. His gunner, Private Collins, squinted through his periscope. "They say Rommel's out there somewhere," Collins muttered. Harris nodded. "Then we'll give him something to remember." They rolled out with the others, a column of olive-drab machines stretching across the open desert. The sun climbed higher, turning the world into a white-hot furnace. Sweat trickled down necks and pooled beneath helmets. Radios crackled with half-heard orders. The roar of engines filled every silence. It was hard to believe they were heading into battle. It felt more like sailing into a storm. By mid-morning, the first shells fell. German artillery thundered from hidden ridges, and the desert erupted. Columns of sand burst upward as explosions hammered the earth. The Shermans pushed forward, treads clattering, their guns swinging toward the flashes in the distance. Through the haze, the black crosses of Panzer IVs appeared. Sleek, low, and lethal. "Targets ahead!" "3 of them," Collins shouted. Harris ducked into the hatch. "Driver, full throttle! Gunner, load high explosive!" The turret whirred. The air inside the Sherman grew thick with cordite and fear. Harris's heart pounded so hard he could hear it over the engine. "Fire!" The first shell roared out, slamming into a ridge just short of a German position. Sand and smoke billowed. The Panzer fired back. Its shell hit a Sherman to their left, tearing the turret clean off. The tank burned, black smoke curling into the sky. Harris didn't look away. "Reload!" Another shell slid into the breach. The gun barked again, and this time it struck home. The Panzer's side armor flared orange and crumpled inward. The enemy tank lurched, tracks locking, fire spilling from its hatch. But there were more. Always more. The desert became chaos. Tanks weaved between plumes of dust and smoke, engines howling, guns spitting fire. Every few seconds a Sherman went up in flames. But for every one that burned, 2 more kept moving. That was the difference. The Germans fought like dueling knights. The Allies fought like a tide. The Sherman wasn't about elegance. It was about endurance. As the day wore on, the battlefield blurred into madness. The heat warped the air, making it impossible to tell friend from foe until it was too late. Over the radio, voices shouted, screamed, cut off mid-word. The ground shook under the weight of 100 duels. Then came the smoke screens. Allied commanders ordered them thick and fast, white clouds drifting across the desert, turning the battlefield into a ghost world. Inside Lucky Penny, visibility dropped to almost nothing. The gunner wiped sweat from his brow. "Can't see a damn thing, sir." "Good," Harris said. "Means they can't either." He remembered the words of an old British officer. "In this war, the clever survive longer than the brave." He didn't know if that was true, but it sounded right. He turned the tank left, angling around a cluster of burning wrecks. Through a thin gap in the smoke, he spotted movement. A German anti-tank gun, its crew reloading. "Target, 9 o'clock." Collins adjusted the turret, teeth gritted. "On it!" The Sherman fired. The shot hit square, obliterating the position. A second later, a shell screamed past them, tearing through the sand just feet away. The shockwave rattled every bone in Harris's body. He forced himself to breathe. "Keep us moving. Don't give them a still target." The Sherman lurched forward again, engine groaning, treads chewing through sand. Around them, the battle swayed like a pendulum, forward, back, forward again. No one really knew who was winning. But one thing was clear. The Sherman was holding its own. By sunset, the battlefield lay buried beneath a blanket of dust and smoke. The smell of oil and burned rubber hung heavy in the air. Mechanics worked feverishly to repair damaged tanks while medics tended to the wounded. The desert floor was littered with the twisted hulks of Shermans and Panthers alike. Silent reminders that no machine, no matter how advanced, was immortal. Harris climbed out of Lucky Penny and stood on its hull, staring out across the wreckage. The horizon glowed red with fire. "We held," he said softly. A British officer nearby overheard and gave a weary nod. "Aye, the Shermans did their job today." For the first time, there was no mockery in his voice, only respect. That night, under a cold desert sky, Harris and his crew sat in a loose circle, eating from tin cans. The stars looked impossibly close, glittering over the dead and the living alike. "Funny," Collins said, his voice tired but steady. "They said we were outmatched." Harris smiled faintly. "We are. But we're still here." He looked at the horizon again, where the faint outlines of broken tanks stood like tombstones. The desert had given them their baptism in fire, fear, and sand. And somehow, they'd come out the other side. Across the lines, German crews were having their own quiet conversations. They no longer laughed about the Sherman. They had seen too many of them, too many times, coming through smoke where no tank should have survived. One German officer wrote home that week. "They burn easily, yes, but they never stop coming. They are like the sea. You push them back, and they return." The war in Africa would rage for months more, shifting with the sands. The Shermans would be beaten, repaired, and sent back again. Crews would die and be replaced. And still, the tanks would roll forward. Because that was what they were built to do. Not to dominate, but to endure. When the Allies finally forced the Germans to retreat toward Tunisia, the Shermans led the charge. Their armor was still thin, their guns still modest, but their presence was unstoppable. They were no longer the joke of the battlefield. They were the backbone of it. As dawn rose over the desert once more, Harris leaned against his tank, eyes half closed from exhaustion. He ran a hand over the dented armor, feeling the rough scars where shells had grazed. "Guess we're not clumsy anymore," he murmured. Collins looked up from his seat beside the treads. "No, sir," he said. "We're just getting started." And as the engines rumbled to life again, their sound rolled across the sands like thunder. North Africa was nearly won, but ahead lay Europe. Darker, colder, deadlier. The Shermans would have to prove themselves all over again. The war was no longer fought only on the battlefields of Africa. It was being fought in the roar of furnaces, in the hum of conveyor belts, and in the rhythmic clang of hammers striking steel. Across the ocean, America had become something else entirely. Not just a nation at war, but a factory the size of a continent. Smoke rose from every skyline. Cities that once built cars, trains, and farm equipment were now churning out tanks, planes, and guns. Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, names once synonymous with industry, were now names of war. The Sherman tank had become their heartbeat. In one such factory, under the great vaulted roof of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, sparks flew like fireflies in a storm. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, their faces streaked with soot and determination. The plant ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was no night and day anymore, only shifts and production quotas. "Keep it moving, people," shouted Foreman Walter Briggs over the deafening noise. He was a broad-shouldered man who'd once built Buicks. Now he watched tank hulls glide past him on steel tracks. Every time one rolled out of the factory, he'd mutter the same thing under his breath. One more for the boys. The workers weren't soldiers, but they fought their own kind of battle, against fatigue, against shortages, against the sheer scale of the task. Rosie, a young welder from Ohio, tightened her gloves and leaned over the glowing metal seam of a turret, sparks raining around her. "You think anyone out there knows who's building these things?" she shouted to the man beside her. He grinned through his mask. "Doesn't matter who knows. What matters is they run." For every tank that left the factory, there was a story like hers. Ordinary people turning ordinary lives into something extraordinary. Housewives learned to rivet. College boys learned to machine. Retired farmers welded armor plates thicker than anything they'd ever seen. They weren't building perfection. They were building persistence. Each Sherman that rolled off the line was almost identical, by design. Parts could be swapped between any two tanks, whether in a French village or North African desert. Mechanics could fix them with wrenches, not miracles. That simplicity became its secret strength, and they came in numbers no army in history had ever seen. While Germany built a few hundred Tigers and Panthers, the United States produced over 40,000 Shermans. Railways became arteries of steel, carrying tanks east and west, loading them onto ships bound for Britain, Africa, and beyond. Every port echoed with the sound of chains, engines, and our orders shouted over the wind. In Britain, dock workers stared in disbelief as wave after wave of Shermans were unloaded. "Good Lord," one muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. The Yanks brought their own army. But it wasn't just the tanks that impressed them. It was their reliability. British engineers tested them and found they could run for days without breaking down. In a war where every minute mattered, that was worth more than armor inches or gun calibers. Back in America, President Roosevelt spoke to the nation in one of his fireside chats. "We are the arsenal of democracy," he declared. And the people believed him, because they could see it. The proof was in the smoke rising above their towns, in the calloused hands of factory workers, in the endless stream of tanks rolling toward the horizon. Meanwhile, in Europe, German officers began to realize something terrifying. Intelligence reports showed Allied tank numbers growing beyond reason. One general in occupied France looked at the figures and muttered, "They're not fighting a war. They're manufacturing victory." The Sherman became more than a machine. It became a promise. A promise that no matter how many were lost, more would come. That the men who burned in Africa hadn't died in vain. That the tide was turning, and the tide was made of steel. Lieutenant Jack Harris, now a veteran of desert battles, found himself in England by late 1943. He stood on a cold, misty morning near a row of freshly delivered Shermans lined up on the dock. Each one gleamed with new paint, olive drab catching the faint light. Some still bore chalk markings from the factories, serial numbers, shipping codes, the faint signatures of workers who'd built them. He traced a finger along one hull where someone had scrawled, "From Detroit, with love." Collins, now promoted to gunner sergeant, gave a low whistle. "They sure don't run out of these, do they?" Harris smiled. "No, they don't. Every time we lose one, 3 more show up. Feels like we've got the whole country behind us, and in a way, they did." The soldiers who climbed into these new Shermans knew they weren't sitting in luxury. The tank's interior was still cramped, the smell still unbearable, and the armor still thinner than what the Germans carried. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that it worked, and it kept working. In training grounds across southern England, Allied crews practiced maneuvers, learned to coordinate with infantry, and drilled for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. The tanks thundered through mud fields, engines roaring, treads churning up wet soil. The sound became the pulse of an army preparing to take back a continent. At night, when the engines cooled and the men rested beside their machines, the conversations often drifted to the same thought. What must the Germans think now? Harris stared into the campfire one evening, listening to distant artillery practice. They used to laugh at us, he said quietly, back when they thought this thing was a toy. Collins looked over at the line of tanks, dark shapes under the moonlight. Well, he said, we're about to show them what a toy factory can do. The men laughed softly, not in mockery, but in confidence, because now the joke wasn't on them. By the spring of 1944, every English port was overflowing with armor. Thousands of Shermans sat under camouflage nets, waiting for the call. Their tracks gleamed with oil, their guns pointed silently toward the sea. Each tank bore the marks of a country that refused to give up. The fingerprints of welders, the initials of workers, the prayers of mothers. The invasion of Europe was no longer a dream. It was an inevitability. And when it came, it would arrive not as a whisper, but as thunder. The tanks would roll ashore, side by side, their engines singing the song of the factories that birthed them. In the chill before dawn one morning, Harris climbed into his new Sherman, a model straight from Detroit. He ran his hand across the smooth metal, feeling the faint warmth from its engine. The desert had tested them. The factory had built them. Now came the real test. Europe. He adjusted his cap, settled into the commander's seat, and spoke to his crew over the intercom. "Gentlemen," he said, voice calm and steady, "let's go finish what they started back home." Outside, the sea mist thickened, and the rumble of engines spread across the countryside. The steel factory of freedom had done its part. Now it was time for the Shermans, and the men inside them, to make history. The sea was gray that morning, cold, endless, and alive with ships. From horizon to horizon, the channel churned with the greatest armada the world had ever seen. Thousands of vessels carrying tanks, trucks, guns, and men toward the storm, waiting on the beaches of France. On the decks, soldiers stood in silence, helmets tight, faces pale. They could smell salt, oil, and the faint tang of fear. Somewhere in that steel tide, Lieutenant Jack Harris leaned against the turret of his Sherman, feeling the ship sway beneath him. The crew of Lucky Penny had changed since Africa. Some were gone, lost to the desert. Others were new, barely out of training, their nerves stretched thin. But the tank remained, rebuilt, refitted, repainted, as stubborn as the men who drove her. Collins broke the silence, glancing toward the dark French coast ahead. "They say it's called Normandy," he muttered. Harris nodded, eyes fixed on the faint cliffs rising through the morning fog. "Let's hope we leave it standing." The order came through the radio. "Prepare to disembark." Moments later, the ship's ramp clanged open, and the tanks rolled forward into chaos. Machine gun fire rattled in the distance, shells whined overhead, and the smell of burning fuel thickened the air. The ocean hissed around the Sherman's treads as they hit the shallows. Water splashed over the hull, drenching the crew. Men shouted, engines roared, and for a heartbeat it felt like the entire world had turned into noise. "Go! Go! Go!" Harris shouted over the radio. The Sherman climbed the sand, engines straining, its treads biting deep. All around them, landing craft spewed men and machines into the fray. Some tanks never made it, sinking in hidden holes or struck by shells before they reached the shore. But the survivors pressed on, climbing over wreckage and wire, until they reached solid ground. By nightfall, they were in France. What waited inland was unlike anything Harris had seen before. The desert had been open and brutal. Normandy was close and suffocating. The bocage, thick hedgerows of ancient earth and tangled roots, carved the land into a maze. Every field was a trap, every turn a potential ambush. Visibility dropped to nothing. The tanks could hear the enemy before they ever saw them. The rain came next, steady and cold. The soil turned to mud, swallowing boots and clogging tracks. Shermans groaned as they fought through the narrow lanes, scraping against the earthen walls. Somewhere in the distance, a German MG-42 tore through the silence, its rhythm like a chainsaw. Then came the deeper sound, the dreaded thunder of a Tiger tank's cannon. "Contact!" Collins shouted. "Where?" Harris barked, spinning the periscope. "Can't see. Too much brush." That was the nightmare of Normandy. The Germans knew every hedge, every sunken road. Their Panthers and Tigers hid behind the greenery like predators, waiting for a glimpse of movement. One shell was all it took. The 88mm gun could turn a Sherman into a fireball before its crew even realized what had hit them. The first ambush came at dusk. Harris's platoon moved cautiously through a narrow path lined with thick hedgerows. The rain had stopped, leaving only the distant hum of insects and the rumble of engines. Then, from the trees ahead, a flash, blinding and violent. The lead tank exploded. "Reverse! Reverse!" Harris shouted, but it was too late. Another shell slammed into the second Sherman, blowing its turret off. The blast wave punched through the air, shaking Lucky Penny to its core. Inside, the crew ducked instinctively, hearts hammering. "Where's it coming from?" Collins scanned through the slit of the periscope. "Left side." "I think... No, wait. Behind the hedge." Harris took a deep breath. "Driver, pivot left. Gunner, load armor piercing." The tank groaned as it turned, treads tearing into the wet earth. Through the smoke, Harris spotted a flicker of movement. A Panther, perfectly camouflaged, its long barrel already swinging toward them. "Fire!" The Sherman's 75mm cannon barked, recoiling hard. The shell hit the hedge, spraying dirt. The Panther's reply came a heartbeat later, a blast that ripped the ground apart just ahead of them. "Back it up," Harris ordered. "Now!" The driver slammed into reverse, the tank lurching back as debris rained down. Then, through the chaos, Collins fired again. This time the shell struck the Panther's turret ring. Sparks erupted. The German tank hesitated just for a second, before its gun swung wildly and fired high. Harris seized the moment. "Fire again!" The Sherman's next shot hit home. The Panther's engine compartment burst into flame. Black smoke poured upward, curling through the branches. Inside Lucky Penny, no one cheered. They just sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle. Another enemy down. But at what cost? When dawn came, the battlefield looked like a graveyard of iron. Tanks, both American and German, lay scattered and broken among the hedgerows. Some still smoldered, their metal twisted and blackened. The rain returned, washing soot into the mud. The bocage wasn't just a battlefield. It was a slow, grinding nightmare. Every yard gained was paid for in blood and steel. Shermans advanced, got hit, were repaired, and rolled forward again. Crews learned to adapt. They welded makeshift hedgerow cutters, sharp prongs of metal, onto the front of their tanks to burst through the dense walls. They learned to fight in teams, flanking and coordinating fire instead of charging blindly. And still, the Germans fought back with ferocity. For every Panther destroyed, 3 more seemed to appear. For every Allied breakthrough, there was another ambush waiting. Harris's unit lost half its tanks in 2 weeks. Yet every morning, reinforcements arrived. Fresh Shermans straight from the ships. The machine that America had built was keeping its promise. It didn't matter how many were lost. More always came. Late one evening, after another brutal day of fighting, Harris sat beside Lucky Penny, wiping grime from his face. Collins handed him a tin of cold coffee. "Feels like we're fighting the earth itself," he muttered. Harris nodded. "We are. But we're learning how to beat it." He looked across the field at the dark outline of a burned Tiger tank. Its massive frame lay half buried in the mud, smoke still rising from its ruined hull. Once, that sight would have terrified him. Now, it was proof. Proof that the unbeatable could be beaten. The laughter that once echoed from German radios was gone. In its place was something else. A quiet, growing fear. They had underestimated the Sherman once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. By mid-July, the Allied lines had finally begun to move. The Shermans pushed through the hedgerows like an endless tide of green steel. Every battle brought them closer to open ground, closer to the breakout that would free France. On the eve of the next offensive, Harris stood on a small ridge overlooking the fields. The night sky glowed faintly from distant fires. He could hear the low murmur of hundreds of engines idling in the dark. "We're almost through," Collins said beside him. Harris exhaled, watching the faint mist rise from his breath. Almost. The Bocage had tested them, not just their machines, but their will. And though the land had swallowed many, those who remained had become something new, hunters in a world of traps. Ahead lay open country, and with it, a new challenge. For in the distance, beyond the smoke and rain, word had spread of a new kind of Sherman, a British experiment that could finally stand toe-to-toe with the Panthers. The crews called it the Firefly. And it was about to change everything. By the late summer of 1944, the battlefields of Normandy had become graveyards of steel. The countryside was littered with burnt-out tanks, Shermans and Panthers alike, their twisted carcasses half buried in the mud of France. Yet amid the smoke and wreckage, something had begun to change. The Allies had learned the hard way that courage alone could not pierce German armor. They needed firepower, and the British were about to deliver it. Captain Arthur Whitmore, a veteran British tank commander, stood beside his Sherman, wiping the grime from his face with a rag soaked in petrol. His tank had survived 3 engagements that week. 2 of his friends hadn't. "It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight," one of his gunners had said bitterly after their shells had bounced off a Panther's sloped front armor. Arthur had nodded, silent, staring at the blackened wreck of another Sherman smoking in the distance. The joke that the Germans once told about the Sherman being a Ronson, lights up every time, had turned into a cruel truth. But somewhere back in England, engineers and dreamers were already working to rewrite that fate. At a factory in Birmingham, a group of British engineers stared down the length of a massive 17-pounder anti-tank gun, an elegant monster of steel. It had already proven itself capable of punching through even the thickest German armor. The question was, could they somehow fit it inside a Sherman turret? It seemed impossible. The gun was too long, the recoil too violent, the turret too small. But British ingenuity thrived in the impossible. They modified the breech, turned the gun sideways, cut into the turret walls, and rearranged the ammunition racks. Bit by bit, they forced the beast to fit inside. The result was ungainly and awkward. The radio had to be moved to a small box on the back of the turret, and the loader had barely any room to breathe. But it worked. When the prototype fired, the shell roared through steel plates that had once been Panther-proof. The Sherman Firefly was born. When the first Fireflies arrived in Normandy, they looked like any other Sherman, at least from a distance, but inside that familiar hull lurked a different kind of fury. The long, slender barrel of the 17-pounder stretched far beyond the tank's nose, giving it a predatory profile. The crews who received them understood immediately that this was something new. For the first time, they could fight Panthers and Tigers on near equal terms. Captain Whitmore's unit was among the first to be re-equipped. He climbed into his new Firefly with the cautious optimism of a man who'd buried too many friends. His gunner, Corporal Ellis, ran his hand along the breech and whispered, "She's a beauty, sir." A proper dragon slayer, Whitmore smiled faintly. "Let's hope she breathes fire when it counts." Their first test came outside calm. The British advance had stalled against a German counterattack. The rumble of Panthers echoed through the fields, their gray forms moving like ghosts behind smoke and hedgerows. Whitmore's Firefly took position behind a row of shattered farmhouses. Through his binoculars, he saw one, a Panther, turning its turret toward a group of advancing infantry. "Target, 800 meters. Panther. Hull down," Ellis whispered. "Steady," Whitmore replied. The air inside the tank felt heavy, thick with heat and sweat. The loader slammed a 17-pounder shell into the breech. "On target," said Ellis. "Fire!" The Firefly roared. The shell screamed across the field and struck the Panther's front armor. And this time, it didn't bounce. The German tank shuddered, flames bursting from the engine deck. For a heartbeat, everyone was silent. Then the crew erupted in disbelief. "Hit! Direct hit!" shouted Ellis. Whitmore gripped the periscope, watching the burning wreck. "Reload. Let's find the next one." Word spread quickly. German tank crews began to fear the long-barreled Shermans. From a distance, they couldn't easily tell which were regular models and which were Fireflies. Many Panther commanders began ordering their gunners to target any Sherman first, a testament to how the balance had shifted. The British crews, meanwhile, grew attached to their new machines. They painted camouflage nets over the barrels to disguise their length, tied foliage around them, and drove into battle with renewed confidence. The once laughed-at Sherman now had teeth. But victory came with a price. The Firefly's gun was powerful, yet its recoil shook the entire chassis. Inside, the cramped space made reloading exhausting work, and German tanks still hit hard. A Firefly's armor was no thicker than before. Whitmore knew that every battle remained a gamble. One night, after a long day of fighting near Villers-Bocage, he sat with his crew outside their tank. The air smelled of diesel and burnt grass. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like faraway thunder. Corporal Ellis broke the silence. "Do you think they still laugh at us, sir?" "The Germans?" Whitmore took a slow drag from a cigarette before answering. "If they do, they're doing it from inside their burning tanks." Ellis chuckled quietly, but no one else did. They all knew how close each battle brought them to the same fate. In the days that followed, the Firefly proved its worth again and again. Allied units began to mix one Firefly among every few standard Shermans, using its superior range and penetration to take out Panthers before they could close the distance. German officers, reviewing after-action reports, began warning their men, "Beware the long gun." By autumn, the tide had fully turned. What had begun as a desperate improvisation became a legend. British and Canadian crews spoke of Fireflies with reverence and fear. They were powerful but fragile, deadly but vulnerable. They required skill, courage, and teamwork to survive. And for the first time in years, Allied tankers could stare down a Panther and believe they had a chance. Captain Whitmore's Firefly led his squadron across the Seine as German forces fell back toward the heart of France. The journey was a blur of broken bridges, smoldering villages, and weary triumph. As his tank rolled past another burnt-out Panther, he glanced at its blackened hull and murmured under his breath, "The joke's over." He didn't mean it as mockery, more a quiet recognition of what the war had become. The Sherman story was no longer one of weakness, but of evolution. The laughter that once echoed from German camps had faded, replaced by the sound of retreating engines and the grinding advance of Allied steel. As dawn broke over the French countryside, a faint golden light spilled across the armor of the Fireflies lined up along the road. Whitmore stood in the turret, eyes on the horizon, knowing the war was far from over. The Firefly had proven itself, but now it would need to carry that fire deeper into the storm. And beyond the Channel, in the factories of America, the machines that had built the Sherman were already roaring again, faster, louder, and stronger than ever before. The Firefly's long shadow stretched across the fields of northern France as the Allied columns rolled eastward. The air smelled of rain and gasoline. What had begun as a grinding push through the hedgerows of Normandy had transformed into a relentless steel tide sweeping across Europe. Town after town, the Shermans rumbled forward, engines growling, tracks clattering, their crews hollow-eyed from weeks of fighting. Captain Arthur Whitmore's Firefly led the column through a narrow country road lined with tall, wind-bent poplars. The morning mist clung to the fields, softening the wreckage scattered across them. Burnt wagons, shattered walls, and the carcasses of German tanks half sunk in mud. The war was changing. Where once the Allies had advanced cautiously, now momentum was theirs. Yet with every mile gained, resistance grew fiercer. Reports crackled over the radio, German panzer divisions regrouping near Falaise, counterattacks forming in the east. The retreating Wehrmacht was wounded, but not broken. The Panther and Tiger crews were fighting with the desperation of men defending their homeland. Whitmore knew what that meant: chaos. As they rolled into a small French village, the cobblestones still wet from an early downpour, the smell of smoke hit them first. The town was a ruin. Stone walls pocked with bullet holes, church steeple half collapsed. Children peeked from cellars, their faces gray with dust. The villagers waved hesitantly as the Shermans passed, gratitude mixed with fear. Liberation had a cost, and it was paid in rubble. The tanks formed a perimeter outside the village. Mechanics went to work tightening tracks, checking engines, and refueling. Whitmore dismounted, stretching his legs for the first time in hours. His driver, Private Dawson, sat on the glacis plate, eating a cold tin of beans. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Dawson said. "They cheer for us, and yet everything around them's broken." Whitmore nodded. "That's war. You destroy the monster to save the village. But sometimes the monster and the village become the same thing." The rumble of distant artillery cut through their brief calm. Whitmore looked east. He didn't need a map to know what it meant. The Germans weren't done yet. That night, under a sky flickering with tracer fire, the counterattack came. The first shells landed in the outskirts, smashing through rooftops. Then came the low, thunderous growl of approaching tanks. Panthers, several of them. The village trembled as engines drew closer. "Mount up!" Whitmore shouted, climbing back into his Firefly. The crew scrambled into position. The loader slammed a 17-pounder round into the breach. "Enemy armor, 11 o'clock, closing fast!" Through the periscope, Whitmore saw them. Dark silhouettes moving through the fog, headlights off, their outlines ghostly under the moonlight. The Panthers advanced slowly, confident, their guns sweeping side to side. "Hold fire," Whitmore murmured. His heart hammered. Timing mattered more than courage now. The Firefly's gun had power, but not speed. Miss once, and you might never fire again. A Panther loomed into view, its turret turning toward a row of Allied half-tracks. Whitmore waited until it began to pivot, exposing its thinner side armor. "Now!" the Firefly roared. The 17-pounder round streaked through the mist and struck the Panther's flank. Flames erupted. Its crew bailed, silhouettes flailing in the firelight. But there were more. Another Panther advanced, firing blind into the smoke, its shells slamming into a nearby Sherman and tearing it open like paper. "Reload!" Whitmore yelled. The loader shoved another shell into the breach, sweat pouring down his temples. The second shot rang out. A hit. Center mass. The Panther lurched to a stop, then burst into flame. But victory had a cost. A third Panther fired from the far side of the square. The shell struck the Firefly's hull, ripping a gouge through the side armor. The tank rocked violently. "Damage report!" "Tracks hit, sir! We're stuck!" Dawson shouted. "Return fire!" The gun roared again, deafening in the confined space. The round struck the Panther's turret, snapping it clean off. The explosion sent debris raining across the square. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of burning oil and the distant crackle of small arms. When dawn came, the village was still. Smoke rose in thin gray threads over the ruins. Whitmore climbed out of his crippled Firefly, his boots sinking into the mud. Around him, the price of the night was clear. 2 Shermans gone, 1 immobilized. Yet they'd held the line. He turned toward the wrecked Panthers, their blackened hulls still smoldering. The laughter that had once mocked the Sherman was long gone. Now, even the German crews whispered the tank's name with respect and fear. As mechanics worked to repair the track, Whitmore walked among the wrecks. He saw the enemy dead, their hands still gripping open hatches, their faces frozen in disbelief. He paused for a long moment, then removed his cap. There was no triumph here, only survival. By August, the Allied armies had closed the Falaise pocket. The German forces trapped there fought with savage determination before finally collapsing. The roads became rivers of wreckage. Burned-out trucks, shattered panzers, dead horses. The Sherman columns moved past it all, unstoppable, relentless. In every direction, the same story unfolded. American, British, Canadian, and Polish crews drove their Shermans through towns still smoking from battle. They faced ambushes, mines, and anti-tank guns. Yet they kept advancing. For every Sherman knocked out, 2 more arrived. The factories back home, those roaring forges of freedom, were sending a flood of replacements that even the Germans couldn't match. What the Wehrmacht once called a weakness had become the Allies' greatest strength: quantity and endurance. The Sherman wasn't the strongest tank, but it was always there. When one fell, another filled its place. When a crew burned, another took the seat. One night, as they camped near the Seine, Whitmore sat on the hull of his repaired Firefly, the stars glittering faintly above. The front was moving east, toward the German border. The war was changing again, from liberation to pursuit. "Do you think we'll ever stop fighting?" Ellis asked quietly, lighting a cigarette. Whitmore exhaled slowly. "Not yet. But every mile we move east, we're one step closer to home." A gust of wind stirred the long grass around the tanks, carrying the faint scent of smoke and wildflowers. For a brief moment, the world seemed peaceful, until the distant thunder of artillery reminded them where they were. As the column prepared to move out, Whitmore climbed into the turret once more. The war machine that had once been a joke was now the spearhead of liberation, the iron fist of an army that refused to stop. And far ahead, beyond the burning horizon, a new challenge waited, a frozen forest where the storm would return with a vengeance. The rain turned to frost as autumn faded from France. By December, the roads were hard as stone and the trees wore coats of ice. The Allied advance had slowed, not from resistance, but from exhaustion. Engines coughed in the cold. Crews huddled in their tanks for warmth, breathing clouds of steam that hung in the air like ghosts. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the war was winding down. The Germans were retreating, the front lines were stable, and many believed the next great push would take them home. But deep within the forests of the Ardennes, the enemy was gathering once more. Captain Arthur Whitmore's Firefly sat at the edge of a Belgian village named Stavelot, its green paint dusted with snow. His men were quiet that morning, sipping weak coffee from tin mugs, their faces pale in the dim light. Reports of strange activity filtered in over the radio. German troop movements, intercepted chatter, armor sightings. It made little sense. The Ardennes were considered impassable for tanks in winter. Even the roads were narrow, winding, and slick with ice. "Doesn't seem like Panzer country, sir," said Corporal Ellis, rubbing his hands together. Whitmore nodded absently. "That's exactly what worries me." Before dawn on December 16th, the first shells fell. The ground shook, rattling the tank's armor like thunder. The men scrambled to their positions. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, a surprise assault by what remained of Germany's armored strength, striking through the fog and snow with terrifying precision. Through the swirling white, Whitmore's crew could hear them, engines growling, metal clattering, men shouting in German. Then, faintly at first, but unmistakable, came the deep, guttural roar of Panthers. "Enemy armor approaching from the ridge," yelled Dawson, gripping the controls. Whitmore peered through the periscope. Black shapes moved in the blizzard. 5, maybe 6 tanks, their silhouettes long and low. The Panthers advanced in formation, their guns already seeking targets. The village's defenders, a handful of Shermans, a few infantry squads, and some scattered anti-tank guns, were caught off guard. "Hold your fire until they're in range," Whitmore ordered. His breath misted in the frigid air. Snow blanketed everything, muting the sound of movement. The only noise was the ticking of engines and the faint whine of the wind. Then, as one Panther cleared the tree line, Whitmore gave the order. "Fire!" The Firefly roared. The 17-pounder shell sliced through the snowstorm, striking the Panther's turret. The explosion lit the village square like lightning. But the Germans responded instantly, their shells smashing into walls, sending debris raining down. A Sherman beside Whitmore's tank went up in flames, its turret blown clean off. The battle dissolved into chaos. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The snowstorm turned the world white, making it impossible to tell friend from foe. Sherman crews fired at moving shadows, their shells vanishing into the fog. The Germans, emboldened by confusion, pushed forward. Inside the Firefly, sweat and frost mixed on the crew's faces. The loader's hands were raw from the cold as he slammed another round into the breach. "Panther, left flank," Ellis shouted. "I see it." Whitmore swung the turret. Through the gun sight, he glimpsed the dark outline of a Panther emerging through the snowdrift. He fired. The shell tore through its armor just below the gun mantlet. The German tank stopped dead, flames blooming from within. A cheer went up inside the Firefly, brief, almost involuntary. But before it faded, another shell whistled past, shaking them to their core. Close one, Dawson muttered, his voice tight with fear. Whitmore steadied himself. They're trying to break through. We hold this road, or the whole flank collapses. For 3 hours they fought without pause. Snow filled the air, melting on the hot barrels of the guns. The village turned into a furnace amid ice. Buildings collapsing, vehicles burning, shells whining overhead. The German advance faltered, slowed by wreckage and confusion. The narrow roads that once offered concealment now trapped them in a snarl of metal and fire. By midday, reinforcements arrived. More Shermans, half frozen and mud-streaked from the march. They poured into the fight like a tide, swarming the flanks. Individually, a Sherman could not outfight a Panther. But together, coordinated, fast, relentless, they were unstoppable. Whitmore's radio crackled with chatter. This is Red 2, engaging enemy armor near the bridge. 1 Panther down. Copy that, he replied. Push them back. Don't let them regroup. Everywhere, the story repeated itself. The Germans had expected to smash through exhausted, overconfident troops. Instead, they found armies that had learned to adapt, to outthink, to endure. The Sherman crews no longer flinched at the sight of a Panther. They hunted them. As night fell, the snow stopped, leaving behind a world of gray silence. Fires smoldered among the ruins, casting flickering light across the frozen bodies of men and machines. Whitmore climbed from his Firefly, his breath a mist in the cold. The ground beneath his boots crunched with frost and debris. Ellis joined him, eyes fixed on the wrecks ahead. They came close this time, he said softly. Whitmore nodded. Closer than we like to admit. Do you think it's over? He shook his head. No, but it's turning. You can feel it. They've thrown everything they have left, and he was right. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last great gamble, was collapsing. The Panthers that once roared with confidence now lay silent under a crust of snow. The Shermans, battered but unbroken, had held their ground. The Allied counterattack followed swiftly. As skies cleared, waves of fighter bombers descended on German columns retreating through the woods. The snowfields became killing grounds. Burnt Panthers smoldered beside shattered half-tracks. The road to the Rhine was open once again. In late December, Whitmore's unit rolled into a small Belgian town. The church bells frozen silent. Civilians emerged from basements, wrapped in blankets, their faces drawn but grateful. A little boy approached the Firefly, his breath puffing in the cold, and reached out to touch its armor. Is it true? He asked shyly. Your tank beat the Tigers? Whitmore crouched beside him, smiling faintly. No, he said. We beat fear. The boy didn't understand, but he smiled anyway, waving as the tanks rumbled away. As they drove eastward, the once mocked Sherman, the tank that burned so easily, that critics had dismissed as weak and simple, now bore the scars of triumph. It had endured deserts, hedgerows, and snowstorms. It had outlasted the Panthers, outmaneuvered the Tigers, and carried an army to the edge of victory. In the end, it wasn't just firepower that had won. It was resilience, of steel, of industry, and of the men inside those cramped turrets who refused to yield. As dawn rose over the frozen hills, the Firefly led its column down an icy road, glittering with frost and smoke. The engines hummed in unison, a chorus of endurance. Behind them, the snow-covered wrecks of the mighty German war machines lay silent, monuments to a fading empire. Whitmore looked ahead, the pale sun glinting off his tank's barrel. One last push, he murmured. Then maybe home. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time in years, Victory no longer felt like a dream. It felt inevitable. Snow still blanketed the fields of Europe when the thunder of war began to fade. The guns fell silent one by one, and the black smoke that had choked the skies for years slowly thinned into the pale light of peace. Across the scarred landscape, broken armor lay scattered, Panthers, Tigers, and countless Shermans, some burned out, others still idling quietly as if waiting for orders that would never come. For many, the war was ending. But for the men who had lived inside those steel coffins, the memories were only just beginning. The Sherman had survived it all: deserts, hedgerows, cities, and blizzards. It had rolled through hell and kept moving. Not because it was the strongest, nor because it was the most powerful, but because it simply refused to stop. In that stubborn endurance, it had come to represent something far larger than itself: the willpower of ordinary men and the unrelenting force of an entire nation that believed in getting the job done, no matter the odds. As winter gave way to spring, Allied convoys moved eastward through liberated towns, their Shermans leading parades instead of assaults. Children climbed atop their turrets, waving flags. Civilians offered flowers, bread, and tears. The same machines that had once been mocked as death traps were now symbols of deliverance. They weren't perfect, but they were there. In every fight, in every place they were needed. And that, in war, was everything. When history looked back, the German tanks would always steal attention. The sleek Panthers, the monstrous Tigers. They were marvels of engineering, no doubt. But they were also fragile monuments to overconfidence. They broke down as often as they fought. They consumed fuel, time, and men like fire consumes oxygen. The Sherman, by contrast, was a soldier's tank. Crude, reliable, and endlessly repairable. If it broke, it could be fixed with a wrench and a prayer. If it was destroyed, another would take its place by dawn. Behind that endurance stood an industrial miracle. In Detroit, Chicago, and countless towns across America, factories had pulsed like beating hearts, never resting, never doubting. The workers, men and women alike, forged armor plates, riveted hulls, tested engines. Each tank that rolled out carried not just steel, but belief. Belief that the war could be won not by brilliance or arrogance, but by sheer persistence. By outlasting, outworking, outbuilding. Even as the war wound down, production lines still hummed. The men on the front knew that if their Sherman was hit, another would be waiting at the docks, painted and ready to roll. That knowledge became a kind of armor in itself, a psychological edge that no German gun could pierce. The crews weren't fighting alone. They were part of something far greater, an army of minds and hands that refused to quit. In the final months, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, Sherman columns stretched as far as the eye could see. Town after town fell, not because of a single heroic tank duel, but because of overwhelming consistency. Shermans didn't retreat. They replaced each other. Where one was lost, 10 more came forward. The German soldiers who once laughed now faced a grim realization. They were being swallowed by an unstoppable tide of determination. For the crews, the end brought quiet reflection. In the smoking ruins of once mighty cities, men leaned against their tanks, exhausted, staring at the rubble. Some ran their hands across the armor, tracing the dents and scorch marks like old scars. Each one told a story of a narrow escape, a comrade lost, a miracle survival. They knew their machines weren't perfect. They knew the myths about Ronson lighters, the horror stories whispered about Shermans that burned too easily. But they also knew something those stories missed: The Sherman had kept them alive when it mattered most. It had carried them forward when hope was thin. It had done what it was built to do: endure. When the fighting stopped, some Shermans were scrapped, others sent to new wars in faraway lands. Yet their legend persisted. Not the legend of invincibility, but of persistence. Long after the Tigers rusted into relics, Sherman still ran in Korea, in the Middle East, in dusty training grounds around the world. The tank that had been mocked for being too light, too simple, too common, refused to die. It kept proving, decade after decade, that survival often favors not the strongest, but the most adaptable. Historians would later debate its legacy. Some would call it flawed, others pragmatic. But for those who lived it, the men who climbed into those cramped hulls, breathed the fumes, and fought mile by mile, the Sherman was more than a machine. It was a companion, a shield, a second chance. Many crews even gave their tanks names: Lucky Lady, Iron Will, Faithful, Daisy May. Each name carried humor, hope, or defiance. These weren't just labels on steel. They were promises whispered before each battle. We'll make it through. By the end, the Sherman had earned something no weapon ever truly sets out to achieve: respect. Even its enemies, hardened Panzer veterans, admitted a grudging admiration. They learned the hard way that the real power of the Sherman wasn't in its gun or armor, but in the men who drove it and the nation that stood behind it. In that way, the Sherman story became the story of the Allied victory itself. It wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. The United States didn't win the war because it built the best tank. It won because it built enough of them, fast enough, and filled them with men who refused to surrender. Every weld, every round fired, every tank that rolled forward was an act of faith in the idea that determination could overcome despair. And when the dust of war finally settled, and silence reclaimed the fields, the Sherman sat there, quiet now, but not forgotten. Their tracks had carved freedom into the soil of Europe. Their presence, multiplied by the thousands, had crushed tyranny not with arrogance, but with endurance. In the end, the Sherman didn't win because it was invincible. It won because it didn't give up. Through the laughter, the losses, the evolution, and the endless march, it kept fighting. And in that relentless advance, it carried not just soldiers, but the spirit of a world that refused to surrender. The Germans had once laughed at it. But when the war was over and the smoke cleared, it was the Sherman, the simple, stubborn, unbreakable Sherman, that stood on the ruins, proving that in the greatest battle of machines and men, sometimes the mightiest weapon is the one that just refuses to stop moving. The tank that won by not giving up, and in doing so, helped save the world.